This ain't your grandma's gluten. Let's talk about why it's making you sick.
Hi. Good to see you,
Welcome.
Dr. Sylvester.
Good to see you, Dr. Hart. How are things in Tennessee?
Loving it. Lots of people out here eating gluten and suffering for it.
Yeah, so not your grandmother's gluten. Boy, gluten is a topic that we talk about a lot. We get tons of questions on. It's almost always brought up.
Yeah.
I want to know everything I've got to know about gluten and how it can affect the way I feel physically, mentally, emotionally. Does it
Yeah.
affect those things? If so, how?
Well, let's talk about a little bit first, some of the areas it really can create illness for us because it does. So many of our patients go gluten-free and like, yeah, okay, that made me feel better, even though I wouldn't have expected that, or I miss my bread. So let's look at why it makes us feel bad. One of the big reasons is leaky gut, right? So gluten, it's that protective coating over the wheat seed, right? It protects the wheat germ there. And so that is not meant to be easily digested. And so it can irritate our gut lining, right? So it takes that gut lining we have and it just creates some holes in it. So at that point, then there's tons of extra inflammation that occurs. We get all sorts of food particles in our bloodstream that aren't meant to be there. So now our immune system's attacking those food particles, creating all sorts of inflammatory reactions. People end up there with leaky gut, brain fog after eating. That's one of the things we look at for food reactions. Is this a leaky gut response? And gluten is directly related to leaky gut. Part of that's because of gliadin, which is one of the main parts of gluten that trigger the leaky gut. They trigger the immune response in that front. So big one there is leaky gut, regardless if you have celiac or not. That's a big one.
But is this whole thing just a fad or an in vogue thing? Like, why didn't we hear about gluten 100 years ago? In other words, what has changed that more people now are sensitive to this seed coat?
I think there's really three big factors. Number one, over the years, we've bred wheat, gluten to be more and more hardy, resistant, so we can try to get it to survive, harsh environments or harsh winters, things like that. And in doing so, the way we've made it more hardy is to increase the amount of gluten, right? So heirloom wheat, all those sort of things, they didn't have as much gluten per capita, if you will, right, per molecule that modern wheat does. That's number one. Number two is the amount of pesticides and herbicides we spray on, especially glyphosate is heavily sprayed on wheat, especially because it dries it out. They spray it to keep the weeds away. They spray it again right before harvest to make it easier to harvest, right? Because it dries it out. So that glyphosate is one of the other big triggers for leaky gut. Also, the highly, highly toxic for us. It's a metal, a mineral chelator, meaning it binds up to our minerals and we can't use them. I know talk a ton about chelators, but it actually sequesters those minerals, right? And then thirdly is the fact that there's more gluten in things. We're eating more gluten, more bread, more pasta, crackers, processed foods. It's inside of things to make them thicker and richer and tastier, right? So some of the major pizza brands, they're like, our dough has extra protein, and so it's doughier. That extra protein they put in is extra gluten, right?
Yeah.
You're getting more gluten in those products than you would even 10 or 20 years ago because it's just used across the board more as a thickener and a dougher and a emulsifier on that front.
Yeah, and I might also add the manufacturing process itself has evolved. So
Mm.
the stone ground mills do a better job at breaking it up and pre-digesting it for human consumption than the steel ground. But with modern, mechanized machinery and the volume, like you said, the demand and more low quality ingredients going in there, the actual mechanical process, the preparation of that seed coat is significantly different between steel ground and stone ground, right?
Yes, traditional preparation methods, which we'll talk more about, but we had them for a reason, and we've sometimes shied away from them for efficiency purposes. But stone ground, right? Stone grinding, even corn, same way, that improves its digestibility when you stone grind it. And then sprouting it, soaking it, all those things improve the bioavailability and the digestibility of gluten and wheat and other products. But, really moving away from those traditional preparation methods has not done us good.
So, what does gluten do in the brain? What is this gut brain connection that people talk about a lot, like you and me on this channel? What
Yeah,
in the
for
world
sure.
is that about?
So we have our own enteric nervous system, right? where the microbiota in the gut and the nerves in the gut, they produce most of our neurotransmitters. Also, a good side effect, most of our immune system, but most of our neurotransmitters. So, for instance, 90% of serotonin produced in the gut, a ton of our GABA, which is relaxing and pain relieving, produced in the gut. Okay. And then those signals from the microbiome and those neurotransmitters, those go through the gut brain connection, which is mostly our vagus nerve, right? Longest nerve in our body, to help balance our brain, help with depression, anxiety, energy, focus, all those things. They found a connection intimately to gut health and our microbiome. Now we know, again, we already talked about leaky gut, but also gluten disrupts that microbiome. It's difficult for our good bacteria, probiota, to break it down and use it for fuel. So it irritates them instead, especially with the glyphosate, which wipes out a lot of our good bacteria, right? So we're not feeding them. And that shifts us towards a pathogenic bacteria. So the nasty guys, so they're really going to create inflammatory cytokines, inflammatory molecules, and decrease those neurotransmitters in our gut. So what we see is that that directly binds to our opioid receptors in our brain. Gluten molecules, for instance, some of those inflammatory molecules, they can actually kind of make us stoned and dopey. So we kind of feel good, but at the same time, it almost becomes addicting and a problem because it's binding to those opioid receptors in the brain. It's triggering.
So
Yeah,
that's a really important point, and I bring that up a lot with patients because I think you and I and a lot of functional doctors fundamentally believe in nature's innate wisdom. I cut
yeah,
my hand, I don't need to tell it how to heal. So why in the world would I, like just like someone's pregnant, they might crave, steak for replenishing iron, or even pica, eat dirt or something. The body is so good at it. Why? This explains why we are attracted to something that's unhealthy and makes us feel worse, because of
yes,
the cross um, binding at the opioid receptor. So just like an
yeah,
opioid isn't good for you, but it's reinforcing, right? Because it stimulates the repeat of the experience. So we are
yeah.
addicted to
Good point.
gluten,
Yeah, that's
craving.
it is. It's a real. It can be a real addiction. Yeah. And we all
Um,
know maybe we shouldn't be going after the things we're addicted to just because for a little bit we crave them or they make us temporarily feel good. Doesn't mean they're good for us in those ways.
so how do they make us think and feel differently? You were
Yeah.
saying
So, I
what's
mean,
the
of course,
cross.
brain fog, depression, anxiety can all be triggered by that neuroinflammation or that shifting of the microbiome, right? If we're disrupting how much serotonin or GABA are being made, that's going to affect our behavior, our mood, all of that. Big one you can see in kiddos is triggering behavioral issues in those kids from that gut brain connection, right? We'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, but they do even find in like autistic kids in their studies, they find gluten molecules literally on the brain across the blood-brain barrier and are there binding to the opioid receptors, creating inflammation, disrupting function directly on the brain. It's not staying in the gut.
How about the autoimmune? You mentioned sometimes you can get this leaky gut and you can get
Mhm.
proteins or food particles that get, presented to these antigen presenting cells. And then the immune system, some's like, "Oh, I've never seen anything quite like that before. We ought to do something about that."
Yes.
How does that go down the stream to now all of a sudden we have an autoimmune illness? Or, I mean, people get gluten and leaky gut, but I don't think they fully understand the autoimmune implications of gluten.
Yeah, I think there's two big factors to autoimmune. Okay, there's what we call molecular mimicry, which is where a piece of body tissue is like so. For instance, in an autoimmune condition like the joints, okay, like a rheumatoid arthritis, and the immune system is attacking the synovial fluid, the joint fluid, right? Well, molecular mimicry is where some of the foreign objects like gluten or a bacteria or a virus look like proteins in the synovial fluid, and so the immune system attacks both because when something like leaky gut happens, and leaky gut is a big trigger for autoimmunity, those gluten molecules float around the system. The immune system has to clean them up, has to attack them and clean them up. And so if they're sitting in the synovial fluid, they might get a little bit of molecular mimicry and misidentification. But I think there's a second concept that happens as well in autoimmunity. Maybe it happens at the same time, but is collateral damage, right? As these gluten molecules are in these areas and the body has to clean them up, or these viruses or bacteria are in the joints or in the thyroid or in the nervous system, like the myelin sheath for MS, then what happens is as the immune system has to go in to attack those and clean those up, there's collateral damage like any war, right? Any war, there's going to be collateral damage. And it's the same thing with the immune system. that as the immune system goes in to try to pull these guys out, the gluten or the invaders, the foreign bodies, there's going to be some collateral damage to the tissue around it and gets misidentified.
So how is that different than celiac disease? I mean, when medical school, I was taught like the only people who have gluten sensitivity are these celiac disease people, which we don't know why it
Right.
happens. It's idiopathic, right?
Yeah.
But still, the Western world only really thinks gluten is relevant to the celiac disease.
Yeah, so celiac is its own problem, right? It's a major inflammatory immune response to gluten. So it's a direct, it's not even the same as an allergy, but it's a specific type of immune response to gluten, very similar to like the Sears cases with mold, different HLA pathway, but similar ideas. They're having a hard time clearing it and have a hyper inflammatory response to it, right? So they have a hard time tagging and clearing gluten, and instead celiac has a major inflammatory response to it. And that's different than, say, gluten causing leaky gut or gluten causing pathogenic bacteria or true gluten allergy. And so celiac is the only, at this point, typically medically defined gluten issue. But we know through the research, like we already said, there's multiple other ways that it can be affecting us. They just aren't recognized yet.
So you and I, wouldn't you say about 99% of the gluten sensitivity is non-celiac gluten sensitivity that we
Oh,
treat?
100%. Yeah, we
Yeah.
tested and it's most people would have a non-celiac sensitivity.
So then you've crossed this gut brain axis. You've got neuroinflammation. What do you do at that point? Like now I've got an immune system that's kicked up.
Yeah.
Celiac, you just remove gluten and it improves their symptoms. So how is this
Yeah.
any different than non-celiac gluten sensitivity?
Yeah, so you can remove gluten and that's going to help, right? If they're having like let's say like an autistic child is having a gluten reaction, especially a neurological reaction, you might have to detox that gluten, right? Not just stop gluten, but detox it out of the nervous system to help the immune system clear it out because it's having this hyperimmune response. We need to help the systems clear out that gluten in order to do that. So detoxifying is a big one on that front. And there's a couple other options, right? So we can do gluten avoidance, which now is getting easier and easier. Okay, that's a biggie. There's certain digestive enzymes, right? There's gluten enzymes that we can take to help us break it down if you get exposed, to help you detox from it, especially if you're taking high doses of these dipeptidases, right, to help break down gluten. Now, look, this is not a taking the enzyme is not a free license to go eating gluten all the time, but if you're not that sensitive anymore and you want to go have a cheat meal, it can be helpful in specific instances, right? So that's a biggie. Doing a glyphosate detox. You and I do this a lot with patients, right? How do you like to detox the glyphosate? What's some ways you like that?
I think the one that I do that's the most different from what you do is I use low dose IV EDTA
Mhm.
sometimes, especially if we're going in there looking at neuroinflammation, trying to get it to calm down.
Yeah,
Sometimes removing it causes a temporary irritation as the body's
yeah,
detoxing. So a lot of times I'll do a combination of like IV vitamin C, for instance, or any good, really strong anti-inflammatory. Glutathione can be helpful and someone who could tolerate that. And then
yeah,
yeah, even low dose EDTA is a good way. But there's all kinds of binders that we've talked about a little bit on the show before.
yeah.
What is your first line treatment for suspected glyphosate removal? Let's say independent of gluten.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, avoidance as best as possible, right? If you're spraying with it, if you're doing it, try to avoid the high glyphosate foods. Actually, even organic wines are a big source of it, right? So try to avoid the high glyphosate donors on
Cereals.
that front. Yes, yep, all the cereal grains, oats, soy, corn, right? Those are all the big ones, heavy sprayed. And then opening up the drainage pathways, number one, right? Kidney, liver, colon, lymphatic support, get that stuff moving, plenty of saunas. And then, like you said, a good binder. After that, we can go deeper, right? Like you said, EDTA. I like that idea. That's awesome. Go in there and take it out. And it's interesting to know, like you said, like can have an inflammatory reaction or bigger when you move it. That's in, or even maybe I wonder if sometimes that's withdrawal. Like we were talking
Yeah,
about opioids.
yeah,
I don't. We want to have to test that out. That's an interesting thought experiment there. But
yeah. It is.
yeah, and then humic and fulvic, right? We use fulvic sludge or carboxy biotoxin binder.